Okay, good morning. So I'm Cindy DeGrone. I'm the projections demographer in the office. And this morning I have the opportunity to present the next 10 years. So in order to think about Colorado's population moving forward, we have to make a few assumptions. And we have questions about some of the assumptions that we've made. And it's not that these are new questions necessarily, it's that these questions over the last few years have gotten louder. So my goal for the presentation today is to, of course, introduce the projections we released on our website last week, but then also to talk through our methodology and the assumptions that we've made moving forward. And with the main idea that we really want your feedback. So what you think of the projections, and if you have input on your local area, we very much appreciate those conversations. That's an important part of our methodology. But I'm going to start out with a little background information. Here we go. So number one, we've heard it a couple times already today, population growth rates are slowing, right? This chart on the left showing Colorado's growth rate in the blue bar, the US in the red line. And what we can see is Colorado's growth throughout the 90s was really fast, right? Growth rates above 2.5%, 3% some years. If we move forward in time on this chart, right about towards the middle, where we are currently, we see the lowest growth rates on record for the United States and really low growth rates for Colorado as well. But moving forward, that's our projections and what we're anticipating. And so we do anticipate an increase from those record low rates, but back up to where we would have been pre-pandemic. But we do see those growth rates slowing. And so what do we know? What is the context under which we prepared these projections? And number one, we know that global population trends have changed. I remember 5 years ago or so mentioning we're debating whether or not we're at peak child. There is no debate. We are at peak child globally. We know that births have been declining in the United States and in Colorado since 2008. And now our total fertility rates for both are firmly below replacement level. So what does that mean in terms of number? So today we're sitting right about 5.9 million people. By the time we get out to 2050, we're forecasting us to be at about 7.5 million. And that's not that different from what we've released for the last few years. But that is very different than any forecast we would have prepared in 2000 or 2010, sort of prior to the significant declines in fertility that we've seen. We always forecast a decline in fertility. We had always forecast one. It just declined so rapidly. But then if I had a crystal ball, right, what year would I look at? And for me, it would be 2030, because there are so many significant transitions that Colorado is going through over this next decade that I think 2030, if we knew what happened by 2030, we'd feel really confident about that 2050 number. So how do we do our forecast? It's been meant, Greg touched on it a little bit this morning, but we begin with, it's an economic demographic modeling system. So we begin with a cohort component model where we project births and deaths, add in an assumed level of net migration, multiply that times labor force participation rate. And we're doing all of this by age at the county level to get a labor supply. And then on the other side, Greg's looking at job forecasts, right? We make that adjustment for multiple job holders and commuters, very important adjustments since this is at a county level, and we get a labor demand. And so what we're really trying to do is balance that labor supply and labor demand. And for the reasons, as Greg mentioned earlier, jobs are people, right? So today we're going to review some of our assumptions, the assumptions we've made for net migration, for births, and for deaths. But the number one thing I would argue that we need to do any kind of a projection is the age distribution, right? So here is Colorado's age distribution in 2023. This chart begins at age 0 and goes through 90. So hopefully you can find yourself somewhere on this chart, and it's color coded by generation. And so if we look at the older end of the age group in light blue, we see the silent generation. And these were the babies born during World War II and the Depression, and there just weren't very many of them. Following them in purple are the baby boomers. So born 1946 to 1964, a much higher level. There's a black line there at age 65 just to kind of orient us. When we talk about aging in Colorado, what we're talking about is this much higher level of the population in that baby boomer generation aging into age groups that were once occupied by a much smaller population. And so some significant changes, big increases in the numbers of persons in Colorado reaching those traditional retirement age groups. Following the baby boomers, we see Gen X. They're in green. First name, the baby bust, right? But in Colorado, we have just about the same level. And then following them, the millennials, the largest generation currently in the United States and in Colorado as well. But what do we see on the other side of the age distribution when we're looking here at Generation Z, or I think the next one's been named Generation Alpha, right? A smaller level in the population aging into age groups that were once occupied by a higher level of the population. So aging almost at both sides of the chart. And when we think about Colorado moving forward, right, we look at that older end of the age distribution, and we've got more people, higher levels, aging out of the workforce, and we've got lower levels aging into the workforce. This is a significant change for Colorado, and it really dictates how we do our forecasts. It's a big, big component. So some of the questions I hope to answer today. Over the next 10 years, all of the members of the baby boomer generation will reach traditional retirement age. Will they continue to age in place? And what does that mean for Colorado? And then we know bursts of decline. Will they continue to decline? And which areas of the state will likely see the most growth and why? And which areas are going to need to maintain services with a declining workforce? So I mentioned we have to make assumptions. Net migrations, we make two major assumptions. The first of which is that we remain competitive and we get the net migrants necessary to fill our expected job growth and replace retirees. So that's the difference this decade relative to the last. Because last decade, we still had a fairly good number of folks aging into the workforce. This next decade, not so much. So we've got more pressure from those aging out and not as many coming in. And we're expecting 40,000 retirements per year over the next 5 years. Second assumption is that the age distribution of migrants to Colorado does not change. So let's talk about that level, and we'll put it in some historical context. Greg showed a chart really similar to this one this morning. So what we can see is that when Colorado's economy is doing really well and much better than other states, we get high levels of net migration. That happened in the 70s, it happened in the 90s, and we did fairly well all throughout the 2010s. But then we see the time periods on the chart where Colorado did not do as well as many other states, including the natural resource bust, the tech bust, the pandemic recession. And so we see very low levels of net migration. But then looking forward, in terms of what we're forecasting, we go right back to that rate we sort of saw in that last decade. So we do anticipate a rather quick move up in terms of the numbers of people coming to Colorado. Over the next decade, that would average about 42,000 people, which is slightly higher than if we go all the way back, that'd be about 40,000 people. But again, that's because of our age distribution and the need to replace retiring workers as well. So, but age matters, right? So who moves here? Many of you may think you've seen this chart before. This is net migration by age to Colorado, but this one's the new one, right? Yeah, because it looks the same. So you can't really tell. The age distribution of migrants to Colorado hasn't changed since 1970. We see that level go up or the level go down depending on what our economy looks like, but the age distribution remains relatively similar. So we can see the majority here between 25 and 35 years of age. We've got the mirror of their kids behind them. And then for everyone over age 50, we have just about as many move in as move out. So what do we know about Colorado, right? We attract early career young adults. We attract families, university students, and that most of those older adults age in place. And this has been the same since the 1970s. But not everywhere's like, in Colorado, all of our counties are different. And so within the projections model, we bucket counties into different typologies in terms of how we model the numbers of persons coming in and out by age. And so the ones that are more similar to the state and they have their dominant feature of migration are young adults, We have 6 counties in the state we call early career, 5 for whom a university influence changes the way their net migration by age looks. And then 8 for whom it's a resort influence. And then for 18, we have more youth moving out of the county than moving into the county that becomes the defining feature. And then for all adults ages 30 and over, we have 5 counties for whom we call family. So I just mentioned Colorado is absolutely not a retirement destination, right? 14 of our counties are. And then we have 4 counties with a large enough prison relative to their total population that the movement of the incarcerated population is really what defines the in and out migration. But then I have 4 counties that don't fit in any one of these categories. And so they're actually more combination counties. So within the model, we model each of them independently. And that's Denver, El Paso, Mesa, and Weld County. And so just to take a peek at some of these, here's our early career. It looks somewhat similar to the state, right? Where we've got our peak between the ages of 20 and 30. But we do see outmigration of older adults, and we see outmigration of more people move out for university age than move in. And that makes sense because none of these counties have a major university, right? It's Adams, Arapahoe, Broomfield, Jefferson, and on the western slope, Garfield and Routt look very similar to this. In terms of families, right? We've got our counties for whom way more families move into these counties than move out. But then there are these young adults who are looking for careers or job opportunities, and more of those move out than move in. And on the Front Range, that includes Clear Creek, Douglas, Elbert, Gilpin, and Park County. In stark contrast to that, we have our young adult outmigration counties. So where way more young adults move out of these counties than move in, we do see the families there, certainly with the mirror of the kids behind them. And then more older adults move out than move in. So where do these older adults go, right? They go to our retirement destination counties. Along the Front Range, that would include Pueblo. Most of the counties in the Central Mountains on the western slope, it would include Archuleta, Montezuma, Delta, Montrose, and Ouray. And then in the San Luis Valley, Costilla and Saguache. And so our net migration assumptions. So we assume this level, right, which is based on jobs, how many workers we need. And then we assume an age distribution. So how might it be different, right? When we think about that assumption, it could be lower if our job growth is lower than what we're anticipating. All the economists this morning, I think, mentioned we've got a tight labor market. And so for some companies who may want to expand, if they can't find that worker, they may introduce, do more investments in types of automation. And if that's the case, our net migration would be lower. And the other big reason would be if retirees don't age in place as they have historically, right? That's a question. Are they going to cash out their equity and relocate to a lower cost area? That would certainly lower our net migration to the states. But it could be higher if our job growth is higher, or we are the lower cost area for California and for New York. So that's a possibility also. But because this is such an important variable to look up any one of your own counties, we have 2 new applications. Adam Bickford created a net migration by age dashboard, and then Todd pulled together a fantastic migration by age groups map that are available on our website. But so in addition to net migration, we need to talk about births and deaths. So deaths, life expectancy did not increase as much as we expected last decade. But we are forecasting that life expectancy returns to increasing. So I am not the expert in terms of life expectancy, and I'm super excited to say that we will have the expert here right after our Q&A period, and she will give us a presentation on what we've seen in terms of life expectancy nationally. And then births. We know young females were the ones who drove the declines in the fertility rates. Because their fertility rates declined significantly over the last decade, while older females of childbearing age actually saw increases in their fertility rates. We assume the same continues moving forward. So Todd created a fantastic application on our website as well in terms of the change in births by age of mother. So now this information is available out there for every county, in case you want to go to the website and take a look. But here for Colorado, we can just see that all mothers under the age of 30 having fewer children, and all females over the age of 30 having an increased number of children between 2010 and 2020. And so this application is out on our website at the county level. So what does that mean in terms of our total fertility rates, right? So the transition in terms of Colorado's fertility rate that we saw, this chart begins in 1970 and goes all the way through our forecast of 2050. And what we can see is our general fertility rate, which is the number of births per 1,000 females of childbearing age, averaged about 65.4 from 1970 all the way to 2015. But what happened in 2008? We talked about the fact that those young female fertility rates started declining rapidly. And so we see that transition right in the middle of this chart to a much lower fertility rate. So moving forward, we're expecting the general fertility rate to average 54.2 from 2023 to 2050. And so what does that mean? We've got this higher level of migrants, right? And we looked, and most of them are young. And then we have this lower level of fertility do our births increase. And yes, we are projecting that our births increase moving forward. We see a couple peaks in the number of births. That's the blue line on this chart. It begins in 1970 and goes through 2050. And births tend to follow strong periods of net migration to Colorado. Again, those net migrants are young, they get together, and then they have babies. So we're anticipating the same thing to happen again, but for that same reason. And then it takes us about this next decade, though, to get back to the level we were at in 2008. So it's a slow increase, and then we level off after that. But then in terms of the deaths, you see we're anticipating that deaths continue increasing, and that's just because of the fact that we're aging. We have a higher share of the population subject to higher mortality. And so the deaths will continue to increase. But the difference between those two is what we call our natural change. And it is natural change. So the fact that we're aging and we're having fewer babies is what's slowing global growth, it's what's slowing national growth, and it's what's slowing Colorado's growth, right? So looking at that natural change on average, we had just over 30,000 historically. Over the next 10 years, we're looking at about 20,000 on average. But again, we're forecasting that increase in births. So if births aren't increasing, or if we don't get the migration that we're anticipating, this number would decline faster. And then after 2030, natural increase is expected to decline rapidly. So what does that mean in terms of our age distribution, right? So Colorado's population by age, this chart showing 2020 in the blue bar and then 2030 in the orange bar. We can see for the 0 to 17 population, by 2030, we're almost at that same level, just a little bit lower. And then 25 to 44, all other age groups increasing, right? To see the difference, it's kind of hard to see which ones are increasing the fastest on this chart. So I made this next chart. And this is our change by age, by these age groups. And what we can see is that the 65 and over population having the largest change over the next decade. So they're actually representing 53% of our total growth. Again, these aren't folks moving in here. They're here, they're us. I can see some of you out there, right? And you're just turning 65 or over. And so it does beg the question, though, how much of the growth within each of these age groups is due to that assumed level of migration? And so if we assume no net migration to the state over the next decade, so we're just letting those who are here in 2020 age out to 2030, we actually see a statewide decline in the prime working age population. Colorado has fewer workers by 2030 than we do in 2020 if we don't get the migrants, right? And all of our population growth would be from the population age 65 and over. But that's not going to happen, right? So if we go back to our initial assumptions, where we have the numbers of movers forecast at the levels that I showed earlier, our current projections are that 52% of our counties, so all of the counties on this map in red, orange, or yellow, experiencing an increase in that working age population. They're being led by Weld and Broomfield, expected to have the highest increases in their workforce, working age population. And then 48 counties, all of the counties on this map in blue or gray, a decline in the working age population. And so what does all this mean for Colorado, right? It means our labor force is going to continue to be tight. Over the next 5 years, we're anticipating 200,000 retirements, and that's assuming increased participation for everyone ages 55 and over. And aging, Greg mentioned it as well, right? Our preferences change. What we spend our money on changes, and that changed our economy. Our number 2 fastest growing industry from 2001 to 2022 on Greg's chart was health services. And so just the same thing, we can expect it again this next decade because we have such a significantly higher level of aging population continuing to move into those age groups. And then housing. This is the teaser for Elizabeth's session this afternoon. So right after lunch, join in. But how does this aging population impact housing, right? For our projections. So we've got folks aging in place in our communities, as we typically have and historically have. But then we've got the demand from the new worker. So I've retired from my job, but I'm still hanging in my house, but my job's still there, right? So we need folks to have a housing unit to take that job. And then millennials are aging into prime and now second home ownership, and Gen Z aging into housing and first-time home buying. But I didn't want to leave you all today without talking about race and ethnicity. And so our increasing diversity. As we know, the residents in Colorado are our most diverse. So this chart I've shown before, it's 2020. It's our persons of color as a share of the total population by age group. And so what we can see from this chart is persons who identify as a person of color, that share is much higher for the population ages 0 to 17 as compared to our 65 and over. So this last year within the projections program, what we really worked on, as I mentioned before, the most important thing in projections is that age distribution, that base, right? And so what we've worked on this last year is getting the age distribution of each race and ethnic group correct in our minds, given what information we got from the 2020 census and other indicators that we have available to us. And so that data is now on our website. We have estimates by single year of age for 2020, 2021, and 2022. And this next year, our hope is to be able to prepare projections by race and ethnicity that'll be based on those race and ethnic groups. So that long-term forecast, let's summarize what that looks like. The map on the left showing projected population change. So based on how raised they are and how red they are, those are our fastest growing that we're anticipating. So red, orange, yellow, experiencing increases, and then everyone in a shade of blue or gray experiencing a decline. So statewide, we're projecting an increase of 1.7 million, 1.5 million of which we anticipate will reside along the Front Range, or about 88% of that growth. Of those persons on the Front Range, about half, a little more than half, so 54% in the Denver-Boulder metro area, 26% in the North Front Range, and then 20% in the South Front Range. But the key with the Front Range, so yes, they're our youngest, right? And so we have our highest level of natural increase, but they're also the only region in the state we anticipate will have natural increase all the way through 2050, where all other regions in the state will enter into natural decline at some point in this forecast prior to 2050. So, but we're anticipating about 10% of that growth in the Western Slope, or about 170,000, 1% on the Eastern Plains, or 12,000, and then 5,000 split between the Central Mountains and the San Luis Valley. So absolutely uncertainties in the forecast, though I think I've talked about the majority of these, but slower national growth. Okay, so the Census Bureau was gonna release their revised population projections a couple weeks ago. Now it's next week, right? So I'm not going to talk about them at all because they're not out until next week. But the last time they worked on population projections, it was 2017. And I can tell you the picture is very different. I think the headlines, and I'm looking over here at some Census Bureau folks, headlines next week likely going to say how much lower their revised projections are for the nation as compared to the projections that they released in 2017. So I don't know, I haven't seen them, but look forward to that next week. But this competition for labor is with slowing growth nationally, and we're anticipating Colorado's going to be able to attract all the migrants that we need for the job growth that we're expecting. That competition is going to be pretty stiff between every state. And then automation as a question, that relative housing cost. So attracting young adults. young adults, man, they can make it work anywhere, no matter how much money they have, right? And so I don't see that as an issue at all. We'll attract the young adults. It's whether or not they're going to be able to stay here and make a family. So it's that out migration that I really wonder about in terms of sort of that family migration. And then will the retirees move in or move out? At the, we've, as I mentioned before, we have as many move in as move out, but will that change over this next decade? We're forecasting that it does not. Um, and I think for good reason. We think about populations, I don't know. That one's a good question. And then remote and hybrid workers, we know that's here to stay. And so growth less concentrated is certainly a possibility as well. And then water and natural disasters can always impact the forecast as well. But at this time, I would like to invite Elizabeth, Greg, and Nancy back up, and we'll take a stab at answering some of your questions. So if you have additional questions, go ahead and enter them on Slido.
All right. So this morning, you've heard a lot of data and information from the office. What we're going to do now, since there's such a connection between all of them, there's a power, and just keep your finger on it, and it should then turn green. And if it doesn't, we'll come up with plan B. On your Slido, if you can see the questions, you can give them like a thumbs up if you really like the question that you already see there. And then it comes to the top of my list. You can also just add in a new question if you don't see your question there. So that's another thing that you can do. I'm also going to ask the team to take, like, none of you have brought your phone. Oh, Cindy, or just Greg does. All right, so Greg will get the ability to do it. I was going to say, take a look at the questions and see if there was anything in there that you thought was fun that you wanted to answer yourself. So now you've given ultimate control to me, which is very, very dangerous. So this one is at the top of the list, and it's a good question, and I think we talk about it all of the time in the office. And it is, can the housing and job data surface any insights on remote workers who live in Colorado? Are those considered Colorado jobs? I'm going to start with maybe Greg first or Cindy. I'm going to bounce between the two. Did you get it to work? Is it on?
This is on. Hello?
Yep.
So I guess the answer is we're still kind of trying to work through this. Closer to I would say my best response right now is that we're still kind of trying to work through this. The data sources haven't always been consistent, I think, in our ability to really truly identify what's remote and what's not. There are things that we use as indicators. Especially when we look at the census loads data, I think is a good example where you can see these very long commuting patterns that are showing up that we suspect are remote workers, but it's still a little bit, we don't have the same level of consistency in the data overall in identifying that right now, and hopefully that's something that changes over time. I think that's probably the perspective I have.
We're going to talk big. But I would just add a couple things to that. And number one is that, so a remote worker in Colorado, that job should not be in Colorado if they're remote working to another state, right? So the jobs data gets reported where the job is. The labor force data gets reported where the person lives. And so they're going to show up in Colorado's labor force, but that job would not show up as a Colorado job. But that, yes, we consider them a commuter. So within our projections model, those commuters include, they would include anybody doing remote work, even if they're not getting behind the wheel of a car and commuting somewhere, they do get counted in our modeling system as a commuter.
You know, and I think the only other piece that I would add to this is, yes, we're waiting for better data, and better data to see if, are we a net in or a net out? You know, we definitely, and I think, you know, tying this into a little bit on the housing that I'll talk more about in the afternoon, is that when we see these remote workers, you know, easily there could be a person here in Denver, living in Denver, but the job is in Boston. So that would be a net end, higher cost city probably. But then what about the person that has the Denver job that's living in Topeka? So it can go both ways, and we just don't yet know what that net is. And what's so complicated is that, you know, there's a lot of people that live in Denver and work in Denver and also are remote. So you can get some really good data from BLS, has done some surveys on what share of some of these remote workers exist. Well, like anything that's kind of high tech or that can be done on a computer is listed as more likely to be remote. Well, like I'm for a lot of the time remote, but I live and work in Denver. So that's the part that I think is going to be really difficult moving forward. Nancy, did you have any add-ons on that? Are you good? All right. So this one, Cindy and I were chit-chatting about at the table. For migration data, how do we analyze why people are migrating to Colorado and why they are leaving for other states? You might maybe want to start on that one.
Sure, and it's a great question because the current population survey actually asks the question, and it's data for the United States, but we don't get that data for Colorado. It's not sufficient enough for that piece, but I think we know, right? I think we know because of their age distribution. And so I think knowing who they are can tell us a lot about why they might be here. And the fact that we've got that incredibly strong relationship historically between migration and jobs in Colorado. The majority of people who move to Colorado move here for a job. And if they're of a younger age and we're in the middle of a recession, perhaps that's impacting Colorado more strongly than other places, they're moving out for another job. So certainly I would argue that that gives us some clues. And so that's why the net migration by age, I think, is a critical variable for that one.
Yeah, I agree on that one. Another one, I'm sorry, we're going to pick on you, Cindy. What goes into the assumption that birth rates will increase again, especially considering high cost of living and healthcare costs? You kind of touched on this, but maybe you want to reemphasize.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Certainly when we're forecasting fertility rates, so we're not forecasting that the birth rate goes up. I'm fighting with technicalities here because the birth rate is actually going to go down if we think about births relative to the total population. That number goes down. So when we talk about the fertility rate though, and we do our forecasts of fertility by single year of age of mother. And so there were really good reasons why we saw significant declines in our teen and young mother fertility rates over the last couple decades, right? When we think about it, what were those drivers behind those declines? It was long-acting reversible birth control, yes, right? Later age at marriage, yes. And then lower immigration to the United States, yes. We had so many things that pointed to that decline. But we did, over the same time period, see increases in the fertility rates for older mothers. And so they just didn't offset those very large declines for our younger mothers. And so we are forecasting that those declines continue for our younger mothers and that the increases continue for the older mothers. But what's happening is a shift in the age distribution of our population, our peak millennials. So all moms under 30, right, had fewer births. All moms over 30 had more births. Our peak millennial at the moment is 30. And so we've got more women aging into those age groups where we have seen increases in fertility rates. And so that general fertility rate chart that I showed, you know, definitely down from what we've seen historically long term, but the births do go up. But we are also forecasting strong levels of migration because we do think we're going to need those workers and that those workers will be attracted to Colorado, but definitely a risk on the downside. If we don't have the housing and we don't have the daycare, we're not going to have the kids.
Thank you. No, that's super. So, and you know, and obviously that's like the biggest long run. I think that Colorado needs to be thinking about, and that will impact our long run population. So there's a lot of questions about immigration and refugees. Nancy, maybe I'll start with you with this. With the increase of refugees coming in from Central and South America, have those counts of immigration been included in our estimates, forecast, and what do we think? So I'll start first with you in terms of estimates, and then maybe go with Cindy in terms of future, in terms of that international migration and the refugees.
So in terms of estimates, as you'll note, our date was July 2022. So anybody who's come since July 2022 are not yet in our data. But the immigration data we get is from the US Census Bureau. And I've actually reached out to our contacts at the Bureau who work on population estimates to find out exactly how does the Bureau count people, especially looking at refugee or asylum status. When I get that answer, I will let you know. But we do know that the Bureau is counting migration and that or the international, and that's the source for our information. That is one of the inputs that does tend to get revised year over year. So when I was looking at the revisions to 2021, the international migration was revised greatly. So it's probably a bit more in flux, but we are watching from the Census Bureau, and I can let people know when I get a response from them about that.
And I'll just add that international immigration is absolutely considered within the population projections. And so the rapid increase that we see in migration that we've got forecast for 2023 does include some of the international as well as the domestic migration. But then thinking forward, this is a huge question in terms of national growth moving forward, right? And so looking at several different sources, the Congressional Budget Office, and then the Census Bureau and Moody's, different ones that get produced, that U.S. growth is completely dependent on that level of immigration moving forward.
And I think, you know, when you saw Cindy's charts, and often when I speak around the state, it's like the number one factor for uncertainty is that international migration number. If it, you know, we've seen it slow down, and especially slow down during COVID, huge impact in the United States. We've seen it change a little bit currently in terms of the number of refugees will have a huge impact in the United States. And I think just always remembering that Colorado tends to be a second tier state. We're not typically an entry point. People on the international side aren't saying, hey, let's go to Denver. It's typically, you know, we're hitting California, Texas, New York, Florida. We're just not, we're not in that top tier. We're second tier. Nancy, a specific question, but I think it's relatable to a lot of other counties, and especially a lot of other counties coming in the future. During your presentation, slide 12, I expect you to remember which one that was. Jefferson County was leading the state in total population decline between 2020 and 2022. Why? You know this.
Death. Jefferson County among the, sorry, don't mean to be dramatic, but Jefferson County among the Metro Denver counties has one of the higher percentages of people 65 and over. Jefferson County is an older county. Deaths had increased. That's definitely part of it. There was also some out migration. And it's perhaps ironic because almost every jurisdiction within Jefferson County built new housing units in this past year, and yet they have this decline. And so some of it is a two-person household of maybe two people 65 and over, and one of them dies. It's a one-person household. It's a bit of a conundrum, but that is why this seemed to affect Jefferson more than other counties. Arapahoe County, for example, its age dynamic looks a lot more like the state as a whole. So it has much more younger people. And if you consider Aurora, in other parts of Arapahoe County. So it doesn't quite have that same dynamic as Jefferson does. So that's the very unique part of Jefferson. But yes, they also built many housing units this past decade. So it's been really tough to reconcile those two things.
So a question that will bring maybe Greg into the conversation. Sorry, I just saw you start coughing, so that's why I'm picking on you. No. But maybe Cindy can start the answer if you are still coughing. I would be interested in hearing more about the availability of childcare and how that impacts our labor force participation or our workforce participation.
Yeah, I can definitely start on this. And from the data perspective, I'm not sure I've delved deep into this, but I do know anecdotally from a number of places I visited around the state in the last year that this is a topic that keeps coming up whenever I'm at events for Chamber of Commerce or other kind of economic development things. Is one of the things that every business owner and economic developer talk about is one of the problems on the labor supply front finding workers is that people just there's a lot of households with children where it's just not they even if they want both people to work, there's just not availability of childcare. And I know this has been a big priority for a lot of these businesses, and a lot of the ones I've talked to have been thinking of creative ways to try and help out with that situation because it does keep people who would maybe otherwise work from being able to. And it is an issue in a lot of places. And I think to some of the other questions, it probably also goes into the decision for people to have children too, thinking about that. So again, I don't know from a hard data perspective, I haven't seen, I guess, specific numbers on this, but from kind of a soft discussion perspective, it's just something that comes up routinely a lot of places I go.
Thanks, great. And we have in the past done sort of a hard data version of this where we can look at the number of kids versus the number of at least registered daycares within the state and look at those areas that are significantly in need of daycare. And so that's some information that is available from our office.
All right, I'm going to do a really quick technical question. How good is the IRS data in measuring migration? And maybe Nancy and Cindy on that one? She's laughing. So that's good. We like that.
Well, did you all file your federal tax returns on time? That's actually been some of it that in the past couple of years with the pandemic, the response date, usually it's April 15th. During that first pandemic year, wasn't it moved to like July and then the second pandemic year? And so the amount of time that they needed to process those things, it limited. So some of the migration data maybe didn't seem as accurate or up to date. There was also the idea that typically people with higher incomes delay filing their taxes. And so there could have been some lag. So again, that is something that's, that's probably where a lot of our migration revisions come from year over year, that processing all the IRS data to find out where people have moved based on their tax returns because of the delay in filing tax returns due to the pandemic. So in theory, things might be smoother and process faster, but that is probably why we get revisions on migration year over year from the Census Bureau.
And I would just add to that we do track the IRS state-to-state migration data flows, which does get released on the IRS website. That is an important component into the way we look at Colorado's population and that migration, because it's one of those bigger pieces where we're not talking about the net. We get to talk about the ins versus the outs. The American Community Survey is another excellent source for that information. And I want to give a shout out really quick to a table right over there in the middle, revenue, and thank you for the work that they pulled together in terms of those. They've got some neat reports on their website if you haven't seen those in the past, looking at movers specifically from Colorado filing.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's a good technical question. People ask us all the time, like, how good is the data? And knowing how it's connected and what's involved with it, I think is really important. And so we also try and look at what are some of the connecting factors as well. Like sometimes when we see maybe migration too low and not enough people, we're like, how good is it? So it's definitely something that we're working on over time to see, to kind of validate those migration numbers that we're looking at. So we're getting close on time. I've got one question left, and it's not necessarily an opinion question, but it's kind of, and it came up kind of during Meredith's questions during Greg's talk, but it's really about this idea of balancing. So the state is trying to reduce VMTs, but we know it does impact downtown businesses. How can we balance the initiative to reduce greenhouse gases, yet support economic growth? Certainly, this is something that we think about all of the time. We're not policy people at all in our office. We are just numbers, thank God. As who was it? Was it Nathan? I love Nathan's comment. I don't make enough to make policy decisions. We're at that same level. But I would be actually curious from your guys' experience and with all of the data that we're looking at, what do you think about this balance between not commuting and supporting economic growth? And maybe I'll pick on you first, Greg. Sorry. He looks at me like, oh, please don't, please don't, please don't.
Yeah, I think the first part is to remember that I naturally gravitate towards, especially in the Denver Metro, there are public transportation options that exist. They've become fallen very out of favor the last few years, and some of that may just be a kind of network effect of the lack of usage. I think maybe perpetuates some of those things. So, I think that's always clearly an option to bring some of that back. I think again, you can also move to the more hybrid work schedule, which seems to be where a lot of companies, anecdotally, that you kind of talk to are moving to. And so you can have a reduction, right? If it's not 5 days in the office, but it's 2 or 3, that also changes things. So, I think there's different ways to balance that. But again, I'm not a policymaker. And so I'm going to admit that I don't have all the answers on this one, but I think there are definitely solutions that you can think of around this and different ways to manage that. So,
Cindy or Nancy, either one of you have comments? Please don't give it to me.
So if the idea is hybrid or remote work where people are not commuting, usually meaning getting into a car to traveling, reducing vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gases, that's one benefit. But there are also other benefits. The time that someone gains, especially if they do have young children, if they are having childcare issues, if they do need flexibility to pick up a child from school or different things like that. So hybrid and remote work has more benefits than perhaps just reduction of vehicle miles traveled. And yes, public transit is still an option in certain locations. But again, yes, it is about a balance. And I think we would all like to have vibrant downtowns. We would like to have all the Starbucks in Larimer Square still open, maybe. But yeah, it is a balance. And whether hybrid is not cutting it in terms of providing that same level of commerce in downtown areas, is this going to be a long-term change? Is this something that businesses will have to look at? Are tourists and weekend traffic in terms of people spending and buying, is that going to be enough? But is it something that is going to change and a reality that we might have to look at?
And I think I'll just finish up with saying, did anybody listen to, there's Colorado Public Radio had a piece on about independent bookstores, because they were talking about the closing of our chapter 11 for, I guess, Tattered Cover. And really what was very interesting about it is that during the pandemic that a lot of people, so the point of the radio piece was that actually they've seen a growth in independent bookstores recently, which is, again, that's kind of somewhat counterintuitive with everything else going on. But what's interesting to think about is that during the pandemic, what a lot of people got into was intentionally supporting businesses and intentionally supporting their downtown. So part of the takeaway from it is, as a community, if we're going to leverage the benefit, right, of hybrid and remote, that we also need to be strategic in making sure that we're going out to facilities and supporting the work that they do. There was some comments in the questions, or I guess the question saying, yeah, I know of all of these other Starbucks downtown that also closed down. Well, we may have had a too high per capita level of Starbucks, and I don't think anybody would argue with that. All right, so with that, I will let you know there are still a gazillion questions on this list. A lot of them have to do with housing, which we'll touch this afternoon. So we're going to keep those questions there. But please help me thank this incredible group of staff in all of the work that we do in our office. We are now going to turn it over to, and Adam's going to come up and save me, I'm assuming. We are so fortunate to have with us, have the ability to have with us today, Elizabeth Arias with the National Center of Health Statistics, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, to talk about longevity. So the opposite side of that changing birth rates, now we're going to start to take a look at the changing death rates. Turn it over to you, Adam.